Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Jonathan Clements. Jonathan and I have been talking about the wars that followed in the wake of Japan's Meiji Restoration. And today we've reached the end, which is to say we're going to talk about the war that Japan launched against America, Britain and their allies, and that started with the attack on Pearl Harbor, famously on 7th December 1941. So welcome, Jonathan, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me back.
I just wanted to start by asking you about something. I was in Tokyo a few years ago and I visited the Yasukuni Shrine. And that's quite famous and controversial because various war criminals are enshrined there. But the thing that interested me more than the shrine was the museum that they've put right next to it. And for the listeners, if you are ever in Tokyo, and you definitely should go to Tokyo, this is one of the things I'd really recommend that you go and see. The reason I found it so interesting is that, so far as I could tell, it was telling me the story of Japan's wars very much from the point of view of Japan's establishment at the time. So in the early halls of the museum, there's, a really enthusiastic telling of the story. It's all about Japan's victories against China and Russia. And there's also some explanation later on about why Japan felt the need to attack America. And while as you get to the end, there are also many stories of the poor, doomed Japanese soldiers, very poignant stories. But you don't get any real sense of acknowledgement that Japan itself was in any way responsible for what had happened. And just to give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, one of the bitterest memories of the war, for the British at least, was the forced labour of their prisoners of war on the Burma Railway. And many, many Allied prisoners, and I should say also countless local forced labourers, were basically worked to death in the building of that railway. And that bitterness endured long after the war had ended. Well, when you come into the entrance hall of the museum, the first thing you see, well, actually you see two things, because you have hanging from the roof is this really rather beautiful Zero fighter plane. But below the fighter plane, there's this railway engine. And beside the railway engine, there's sort of a photograph of some men standing behind it. And the engine is in the jungle in Thailand, covered in vegetation, and they're sort of standing beside it looking extremely happy. They've tracked down this engine in the jungle and they've brought it back to Japan. They've restored the engine and they've put it in the Yasukuni Museum. And as a British visitor, it just came as quite a shock to see this sort of celebration of the Burma Railway. But regardless, it is a splendid museum. And as I say, not least of what I liked about it, I'm not sure liked is the right word, but what I really appreciated is that it wasn't just a museum of things, but it was also a museum of attitudes. And I felt I got a glimpse of how the military and the nationalists in Japan back in the 1930s, how they were seeing the world. Because normally the story I hear is purely from the point of view of Britain and America. So I thought that was really valuable. So again, sorry for the long introduction, but I wondered, before we start talking about the war, I'd be interested to hear something about the Yasukuni Shrine and the museum and the attitudes and the belief that they represent.
I think the Yasukuni Shrine is something that has been ridiculously controversial over the years for all kinds of different reasons. And today it is most infamous for being the site that enshrines a bunch of Class A war criminals. And we'll get to what a Class A war criminal is later on. And so, very controversially, Hirohito refused to go after a while, after the war, because he realized that it was causing trouble. I don't think the emperors have shown up there since the 70s. And when a new prime minister is elected in Japan, it's always like, will they go to Yasukuni or not? And quite often they do visit Yasukuni because it appeals to those on the right wing. In terms of wings, the right wing dominated the Japanese education system right up to 1945, and the left wing took it over thereafter. So there's this huge kind of swing in kind of attitudes and and the way stories are told, within Japan, the story the Japanese tell about themselves, for example. But Yasukuni has always been there. And I mean, to give you a bit of context, when it started out, it was controversial for who wasn't enshrined there, not who was. Because it began as the Shokon Sha, the shrine to summon the spirits, and it was built in 1869 to enshrine the spirits of those people who died in the service of the emperor during the Meiji Restoration. So the people who fought for the emperor in the Meiji Restoration got to be buried, not buried, but got to have their symbolic souls enshrined at the Shokon Sha. And the people who fought against the emperor, the people who fought for the shogun, didn't get in. So the idea was this shrine was a place that, that valued your patriotism. 10 years later, it got rebranded. Over the years, Yasukuni has become a place that enshrines everyone who dies in the patriotic service of the Japanese nation. But that became a controversial issue after 1877 because Saigo Takamori, one of the samurai who led the Meiji Restoration, who kind of fought in the Battle of Ueno, led a rebellion. He felt he'd been swindled. This wasn't what he fought for. And so he led very famously the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, which was roundly put down by the new conscript army.
Hang on, you say he didn't get what he'd signed up for? What had gone wrong?
Well, we talked about this in the first podcast. See, when the Meiji Restoration happened, a whole bunch of people thought that they were going to keep the foreigners out, and that the whole thing was like an anti-immigration stance, and that the samurai would stay in charge, and there'd be a new competent shogun or something like that. And what Saigo Takamori got was a constitutional monarchy with a democracy slowly creeping in. And he had to cut his hair, and he wasn't allowed to wear his swords anymore, and he didn't get anything that he thought he was fighting for. And he was the inspiration for the character played by Ken Watanabe in The Last Samurai, if that puts things in movie context. And he was a grand failure, but his nobility of purpose is something the Japanese have always admired, and his most famous saying was a quote from an ancient Chinese book. He said, "It's better to be a shattered jewel than an intact roof tile." And what he meant by that is that he didn't want to be another brick in the wall of a modern state. He wanted to go out with a blaze of glory, which indeed he did. Now, very controversially, he wasn't enshrined in the Shokonsha Shrine. The emperor changed the name of the shrine to Yasukuni, which means pacifying the nation, after the Satsuma Rebellion. And if you go to Ueno Park, there's a statue of Saigo Takamori there, and very famously, he's not in armor, because they wouldn't authorize putting him in armor. He looks like he's wearing a dressing gown, actually. And but anyway, so Saigo Takamori became an incredibly popular figure. His doomed rebellion was something that was greatly admired, and the stance that he took was something that was taken up by his colleagues, his former countrymen from Satsuma and Choshu in the army, in the navy. By the 1890s, the quote, "Die as a shattered jewel," had made its way into the Navy battle hymn, which meant that every day someone was singing it somewhere on the Navy. And indeed, it was being played on the radio on the day that Chuichi Nagumo's fleet was steaming towards Pearl Harbor.
So that's the shrine, but what do you know about the museum itself? Because as I say, it just struck me that this felt like this is a place where the nationalists are still very much in charge of the narrative.
Yes, they are. And there have been numerous, protests about it. In Japan, there have been at least 2 bombing attacks on the Yasukuni Shrine, if I remember rightly, by people protesting about the story that it tells. But it's a very difficult line to walk if you want to talk realistically about the feelings of the Japanese nation during the 1920s and the 1930s. Modern historians say we can't assume that everyone was in lockstep behind the generals. There's lots of people kind of bullied into it, and pretending that the whole nation was of one heart and one mind is very unfair. But nevertheless, when you are celebrating a nation's wartime achievements, and it's a nation that lost, and it's a nation that then, during the occupation period, very publicly and repeatedly was told you were led into this by the samurai and the nobles. You were deluded by fake news. It's a very difficult story to tell, because at a certain level, everyone in Japan was colluding in the war effort. That's exactly what Koiso Kuniaki's plan was for total war. By the end of the war, there were teenagers working in the factories, and children were expected to wave the Navy flag, and everyone was expected to be part of the war effort. And one of the problems that the Americans had, the Allies had when they took over the occupation, was that they started trying to kind of hunt down war criminals, and in the end, it was very difficult not to say that everyone in Japan was supporting the war effort in some way.
Sure.
And so, it's been a long time since I've been to the Imperial War Museum in London, for example, and I think the narrative there is slightly different. It kind of acknowledges that imperialism and colonialism might be something that we might not necessarily want to be proud of now, but nevertheless, you want to report the way that the imperialists and the colonialists felt happy about it 100 years earlier, while perhaps acknowledging the people that they were oppressing. And I think that's the problem with the Yasukuni Shrine, is that it does tell you very reasonably the story of the Japanese, but does it really tell you the story of the Filipinos and the Chinese and the Koreans and the Allied soldiers that fought against them?
Yeah. Okay, well, look, let's get to Pearl Harbor. 7th December 1941, which Roosevelt famously says is a date that will live in infamy. So the obvious question is, what on earth were the Japanese thinking? Why were they launching an attack on the Americans, and why were they doing it then?
The Japanese have been aiming for 20 years or more at autarky. They wanted to have not just the home islands, but an area around the home islands that would provide them with resources and materials that would allow them to basically wall off the rest of the world. There was a certain group within the army, certainly, which said, we kind of want to be an isolationist power again, like we were during the Sakoku period, but we just want to be a bit bigger. We want to kind of incorporate Manchuria and Korea as well, because that way we won't have to worry about the Americans cutting off our trade or losing the sea route or anything like that. And the Navy had a different angle. They wanted to move south to kind of take over the Dutch East Indies, maybe, to enjoy this vast Pacific island network that the Japanese had sort of slowly put together. In both cases, they were being threatened by the cutting off of their oil supply and by the running out of their money. It was put to the generals and the admirals that we had to do something about this. And Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the famous reluctant admiral, was the guy who gave them the advice. We talked about this last time, is that what I did mention is that he had real form with the Americans. He'd studied in America. He was an accomplished poker player. He traveled all over America with his winnings at poker. He knew a lot about America from having been there in person. And he'd also been repeatedly threatened by ultranationalists for behaving as, in their eyes, in a conciliatory way towards the Americans. And he said, no, the way you can do this is you can buy yourself some time to have your materials supply, your oil supply online by taking over the Dutch East Indies. But to do that, you've got to take out the Americans. You've got to deliver a knockout blow to their fleet at Pearl Harbor that keeps them out of your way for 6 months. And then you've got 6 months to do what you need to do, rationalizing your forces, getting everything together in Southeast Asia. But he warned them. He said, after 6 months, they're coming at you with everything they've got. And it is an entire continent that will be retooled to destroy you. So you've really got to do a good job of this. And so Pearl Harbor itself was a fantastically bold tactical move. It stretched the Japanese fleet to its very limits in fuel. They had to launch their fighters from way, way far away. It was a surprise attack that did immense damage to American forces and did indeed shut them out of the Western Pacific for 6 months. So in that regard, it did what it was supposed to do. But Yamamoto's warning was largely unheeded. His entire quote, which added the bit at the end about how then it'll all be over when they come for you, was normally gently cut out from whenever anyone talked about it. So the fact that this was a real Hail Mary was something that not a lot of people appreciated.
Well, I'd like to sort of push back a little bit on the fact that it achieved what it set out to do. It seems that Pearl Harbor is actually quite shallow. So when they sank the battleships, they sort of gently subsided beneath the waves by about 8 feet or whatever it was. And then they sort of rested there. And in due course, the Americans were able to patch them up. And I think out of the battleships that were sunk, I think all but one of them they managed eventually to refloat. And they didn't have time for some reason, or they missed out hitting the repair yards and the fuel dumps. So Pearl Harbor remains a facility that can still be used. And then finally, the worst of their luck, if you like, is that the 3 aircraft carriers that America has at this stage in the Pacific, they'd all been sent off somewhere else. So they missed the aircraft carriers.
That's all true. I don't disagree with any of that. I've been to Pearl Harbor, and the Arizona is still there underwater with this kind of have you been? It's got this kind of monument over the top of it, and it's a very moving place to go. The curators there, as your boat kind of chugs over to the Arizona, they give this long speech about how this is a war grave, and can we not have any stupid selfies? And each day they tell a different story about one of the men who died on the Arizona, and they kind of get, and there were many of them, so he gets them through the year. So yes, the ships were sunk in shallow water, but they were out of commission for 6 months. You're absolutely right about the fuel dumps and the repair facilities. Admiral Nagamore, who was in charge of the attack, didn't want to come back for another strike. He didn't want to risk his planes anymore. His ships were already very, very far out of range, and so he didn't order a return. The Japanese did actually attempt to make a second attack on Pearl Harbor some months later, with seaplanes. They flew these seaplanes out to these a reef a long way away from Hawaii, and they and then the idea was they were going to refuel there, and then they were going to take off and bomb Pearl Harbor. But that didn't. And the whole point of that was to destroy the repair facilities as well. And yes, the business with the aircraft carriers is one of those remarkable and suspicious coincidences that they just happened to be out, on a cruise at the time that the surprise attack came, and the Americans were very lucky there. However, I think the attack on Pearl Harbor did what it was supposed to do. Maybe they were a few weeks earlier in striking back than they would have been if those facilities hadn't been destroyed. And there's some discussion about if Pearl Harbor if they'd got all 3 carriers as well and destroyed the repair facilities, would that have made the Americans say, oh, well, we're going to stay out of the Pacific now? Which I think is quite naive. I don't think Americans behave like that when you bomb them. I think 911 tells you how Americans behave when you bomb them. And I think that the Japanese, if they thought it was going to be like a newspaper on the nose for a dog and it would kind of run away, that was never going to happen. That's why I say it was an immense tactical victory. Strategically, the things that a fleet didn't achieve on that attack would eventually return to bite the Japanese, absolutely.
Okay, so flipping it slightly on its head and going with a counterfactual. I think counterfactuals are good fun, but most historians sort of look at them slightly jaundiced eye. But supposing the Japanese had tried a different strategy, which was to say, okay, we need the supplies in the Dutch East Indies. Let's attack the Dutch East Indies. Let's leave the Americans alone. Let's not attack the Philippines. Let's not attack Pearl Harbor. Let's just ignore them completely, attack the British and Singapore, attack the Dutch. So my thought is, I'm sure that President Roosevelt would have wanted to fight, but at the time, Congress is very isolationist. So do you think there's a chance that they could have achieved what they wanted and gained more time, or maybe even kept the Americans out altogether just by leaving them alone?
No, I don't think so. I think America was drifting towards the fight anyway. There would have been some other incident that would have dragged America in if it wasn't for Pearl Harbor. If they had gone straight for the Dutch East Indies, the Americans would have been behind them at the Philippines. Because you say counterfactuals are disliked by historians. They're part of military policy and have been for 100 years. So the Americans had a plan for what to do if they were attacked by Japan throughout the 20th century. And up until 1940, I think, the plan was anytime there's trouble in the East, we get the whole fleet from Pearl Harbor and we head straight for the Philippines. And that was changed just around the time, just about a year before Pearl Harbor. I think that an attack on the Dutch East Indies would have stretched the Japanese fleet even further. Don't forget, they're running out of fuel, and their expectation was that the British and the Dutch would have destroyed their oil refineries at the first sign of an attack, that there would have been a sabotage. And as a result, that would have made life much more difficult for them. Also, I think it's worth bearing in mind that Pearl Harbor was not the only place that was attacked. There were many other places that were also attacked on the day of infamy, including the Philippines, including Singapore. And so in some ways, though, those attacks did happen. We remember Pearl Harbor because it was such a success, but so too was the fall of Singapore, as far as the Japanese were concerned, and the other places they attacked. So is it a counterfactual, or are we just not noticing that it already happened?
Well, my point was counterfactual in the sense that you hope that the American Congress will be so isolationist that at least it'll take time for them to engage in the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting to see what Roosevelt's position was. Sarah Payne, I was watching an interview with her only last week, and her position was Roosevelt was terrified that the Japanese would attack Russia. And if they attacked Russia, it would drag Russian forces away from the European front and make life so much more difficult for Europe. She suggested that he might actually be relieved by an attack on Pearl Harbor because that would save American lives in Europe, even if it cost them in the Pacific. And it's very interesting to note what the reaction was among the Allies. Chiang Kai-shek very famously danced for joy when he heard the news of Pearl Harbor because it meant the Americans were coming to help him in China in a much greater way than they had been before. And Winston Churchill went off for a very peaceful and restful sleep, happy that this meant the Americans were coming. Whereas in Japan, you've got people like Matsuoka who had advised joining in an alliance with the Germans and the Italians to keep Japan out of the war, saying, "Oh my God, this is exactly the opposite of what I wanted to happen." So it's very, very mixed reactions to it.
Okay. So, you mentioned there were attacks, well, not just on Pearl Harbor, but attacks all over the East. And one of the problems the Japanese have is that they're too successful in a way because they take huge numbers of prisoners. And I sort of mentioned in my introduction, I think one of the things that sort of stays in the memory for the Western powers was how their prisoners were treated. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yes. And this is a very emotive issue as well, which never left my grandparents and their generation. So the Japanese were incredibly successful in Singapore and Hong Kong, in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. Their period of running wild, as Yamamoto called it, did indeed last for 6 months. And they acquired tens of thousands of prisoners of war and non-combatant prisoners as well, with no idea what to do with them, with no facilities or logistics for processing that many people. So a lot of them ended up in camps, used as slave labor. The position of the Japanese had always been that you have to shatter like a jewel. You don't surrender, you go out in a blaze of glory. And so the fact that all of these people from the other side had surrendered was not something that they were prepared for in any way. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention about the treatment of prisoners, which related to the treatment of prisoners, but they'd never ratified it because in 1934, the army minister protested. He said, "We can't sign this because if we sign this, we are agreeing to treat our prisoners better than our soldiers," which tells you something really important about life in the Japanese army, that if you kept to the provisions of the Geneva Convention, you'd be treating someone better than a Japanese soldier. There have been numerous discussions of the way that the samurai ethic dragged its way into the Japanese military. There have been numerous excuses about how, you take a country that has been pretending it lives in the Middle Ages for 250 years and you drag them into the modern world, but nothing has really changed for them in terms of their attitude towards the prisoners. For example. I think that's simplistic, but it certainly explains a lot about the way the Japanese behave. So as far as they were concerned, their own soldier's manual, which eventually infected the education system as a whole and the common people, said that it was better to die than to surrender. And so their attitude towards the people who had surrendered was that they were less than human. The Japanese were awful to everybody, and the number of atrocities were so huge that the various war crimes trials couldn't process them all. I mean, we might get there later on in the podcast, but the famous Tokyo trials were only one of them. There were also trials in Australia. There were trials in Hong Kong. There were trials in China that went on till the 50s. And in some cases, they kind of reached a sort of time limit and said, okay, well, the rest of you can go because we've run out of interpreters or we've run out of, legal time. Even so, 900 people were executed as war criminals at the end of the war. And that doesn't include the ones who were imprisoned.
And what's morale like back on the home islands? Because this is presumably, seen as a massive success. Is it greeted with joy? Are there doubts? Can anyone even express a doubt at this time in history?
There's not a lot of expressions of doubt going on. There's been some very good work recently by historians saying that there were some Japanese dissenters who found a way to be negative about the war by pretending to be positive, and that you have to read between the lines sometimes. I mean, there was a newspaper, for example, that reported about the glorious return home of our soldiers, but had a picture of a bunch of coffins, and got away with it because of the way the caption was positioned on the page and the fact that you'd need to be looking really carefully to work out what it referred to and so on. Basically, the population were told this was a fantastic victory. They were told that this was what Yamamoto had wanted everybody to do, and it was a part of a great plan. And for 6 months, this was true. For 6 months, the Japanese were scoring incredible successes right up until, was it July 42, when they landed on Attu, when they landed on an island that's part of Alaska. So technically, they landed on American territory and planted the Japanese flag. And this was like a huge, huge series of celebrations. No one dared stand up to them. We talked last podcast about Saito, the politician who stood up in the Diet and said, what is this for? Well, the Army and the Navy said, what this is for is that once we've defeated the Americans in the Pacific, we get everything we want in Southeast Asia, we are done. And the big controversy on both right and left in Japan, I feel, is that Japan, here's another counterfactual for you. It's possible that if Japan had called a halt to its activities at a certain point, they might have been able to retain bits of their empire. It's possible that they could have offered a deal in, say, 1942 and said, look, okay, sorry about this, we'll stop, we'll concede, we'll give back, we'll give back Attu, just let's keep Manchuria, and sorry about the whole thing, and we'll do some. But by that point, because of Pearl Harbor, they didn't think the Americans were going to turn back in their counterattack, and the Army and the Navy had doubled down constantly on the risks. I mean, Pearl Harbor itself was such a gamble, but after that point, it became readily apparent that the Army and the Navy were fighting for their lives, as an institution and as people who were going to get hanged in the event of a surrender. They kept on saying how great things were going, even when the tide started to turn at Midway.
Things did go well, and this is something, it's too big a subject, I suppose, for the podcast, but there's this ignominious defeat of the British at Singapore. There's the sinking of these two huge ships that I can't remember the name. Is it the Repulse and the Prince of Wales?
Prince of Wales, yeah.
Hong Kong is taken. Well, it's maybe not so hard, but the Philippines, at least the Americans put up a bit of a fight for the Philippines, much more so perhaps than the British did, and to get the Dutch East Indies. To me, at least, I don't know as much about this subject as I should, but it just strikes me as to why the British and the Dutch in particular, why they're so weak, because presumably they know the terrain. They've had years, they've had decades and decades and decades to fortify their positions. And it's not as though they won't have been aware that Japan is, at least in terms of military planning, they're the obvious enemy. And yet they just fall over almost immediately.
There was a surprise attack, and I suspect as well that we're looking at a military complex that is much more concentrated on the European theatre than it is in East Asia.
Yeah.
And when it comes, I mean, you dismissed the defence of Hong Kong out of hand, which I...
Only out of ignorance.
Oh, no, well, out of being informed, let me tell you, you're absolutely right. A couple of months ago, I was at the Liemon Battery, which was the main kind of gun emplacement on the approach to Victoria Harbour. And there's this big kind of, I think they're Armstrong cannons that are kind of pointed out across the water. And they were there for 20 years before someone realised that the elevation was wrong and the only thing they could hit was Kowloon. So if you were a ship flying in, they were coming in through the water, they'd just go right over your head. Hong Kong is famously indefensible. It's a wonderful harbour, but you can't wall it off. My old Cantonese lecturer used to be in the RAF auxiliary in Hong Kong, and they had, I think, 3 planes, and their plan was, if Hong Kong's attacked, get in the planes and run. Because there was very little chance of defending it. Of course, there were some fantastically brave efforts by the local people to fight after Hong Kong fell, when in their linking up with the East River Column across the border in China. But nevertheless, Hong Kong was indefensible, and I'm not sure Singapore could have stood, particularly when the Japanese came at it the way they did through the jungle. The big tragedy with Singapore was that the fall of Singapore lost the British most of their interpreters. So back in England, there was this huge scramble to teach people how to speak Japanese and Chinese, because they'd lost them all at Singapore. So SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, had this fantastic program that kicked off immediately, where they were recruiting people all over the British Isles saying, "Are you good at French? Are you good at German? Are you good at chess? What kind of music do you like? Okay, report here." And they had this intensive program to teach Japanese, which Peter Kornitsky has written a fantastic book about. So anyway, I think the British were taken by surprise. They were overextended. They were concentrating more on Europe. And the Japanese move was so bold that I don't think anyone thought they would do it. The idea that Pearl Harbor could be attacked as part of a Japanese assault had been part of American military thinking for 30 or 40 years. But the idea that they would actually do it,
right,
in order to protect themselves for 6 months, doing what? That's the thing. Yamamoto said to them, this is a really, really risky thing to do. And what exactly do you hope to achieve in these 6 months that's going to make this work? And the top brass, particularly General Tojo, really thought that they could behave the way that they behaved in previous wars. Grab a bunch of territory, give a little bit of it back as a sort of deal, and then hold on to it. It's how they behaved in the Sino-Japanese War. It's how they behaved in the Russo-Japanese War. They were hoping that this time they could just get a bigger chunk. And I think that's the thing. We think of World War II today, with 2020 hindsight, as a quest by the Allies for unconditional surrender. Whereas I think Tojo was thinking it as a deal that he made with guns.
Yeah. So we mentioned the Japanese taking over. Is it Atulu, did you say? Atu, and in, I think, June or July of 42. But even before that, the Americans have started to strike back, because they have this famous bombing raid on Tokyo. That's the Doolittle bombing raid. So what's all that about?
The Doolittle raid is one of my favourite bits of World War II history. I absolutely love it because it's so crazy. And if you see the film Pearl Harbor, Alec Baldwin plays Jimmy Doolittle, and you can see him thinking throughout the film, why is this film not about me? I'm the story here. So what happened was Pearl Harbor is attacked. Roosevelt takes America into the war that he's promised that he wouldn't take them into. And to build American morale and to really kick the Japanese in the nuts, he wants to do something show-offy. And there's this harebrained scheme to get a bunch of bombers and to put them on aircraft carriers, sail them as close as they can possibly get to Asia. And then the bombers would take off from the aircraft carriers, bomb Japan, and they wouldn't have enough fuel to get back. I mean, ironically, for everyone who was shocked at the kamikazes, this was a one-way mission. And the idea was that the bombers would then continue on to China and either link up with Chinese forces or ditch in China. So they had to, rip everything out of these planes so that they would fly and put in extra fuel tanks and get them all ready. Find pilots who were prepared to volunteer for a one-way mission in the vague hope they could jump out with a parachute somewhere over China. And off they went. And they turned up in the sky over Tokyo and Kobe and Osaka and dropped their bombs. And the Japanese were totally not ready for this. Remember, the news in Japan is saying, we're winning, we're doing great. We show those Americans who's boss. And in fact, I have the diary of Mochinaga Tadahito, who was one of the animators working on Japanese propaganda films. And they were working on Momotaro's Sea Eagles in 42, which was all about how great the Japanese were and how they'd really shown everyone in Pearl Harbor who was boss. And they were kind of on the roof having a fag halfway through their work for the day, and they saw these American bombers come over Tokyo Bay and start bombing the city, and they were like, this message that we're sending that we're winning is probably corrupt in some way, isn't it? And so it was a huge shock to the Japanese, and to deal firstly with the impact of the bombs, it was purely a propaganda exercise on the part of the Americans. It didn't do lasting damage to Japanese industry. At least one of the bombs hit a school, which led to the execution of the captured airmen as war criminals. I think Tojo was arguing for that anyway.
I was a bit shocked by that, because when you imagine what the Japanese had been doing in their period of attacks and what they've been doing in Manchuria and in China, since the 1930s, to turn around and say, "Oh my God, a bomb has hit a school. This is an unthinkable crime that must be punished by execution." I mean, come on.
Well, yes, bullies can dish it out, but they can't take it. I think would be the succinct version of that. The Japanese in the home islands were often, I think, unaware of what their soldiers were doing. This has been a question that's often been revisited by historians, because, for example, there was a famous case during the war crimes trial of two soldiers who had a competition to see who could behead the most people in Nanjing. I think it was like first to 100 or something. And they were put on trial and eventually executed as war criminals. And they were saying, "Oh, that didn't really happen." And they're like, "Well, we have the press reports from the Japanese news saying what the score is."
Gosh.
So in some cases, the actions of Japanese soldiers abroad were being reported, were known to the media. But I think when you divide the world into us and them, and them are non-human, then when the other turns up and strikes back, it's a shock. And Tojo himself said in his defense, in his rather haphazard and unlikely defense, that his war crimes story. So you have to understand how people felt at that time. It's like, yes, we do. So yes, it's a remarkable double standard, but war makes monsters of everybody.
I mean, that's true.
Ask someone in Dresden how they feel about the RAF, or there's a terrifying Danish film, which I think is very unimaginatively called The Bombing on Netflix, which is about a very daring and much celebrated RAF raid on Denmark, which hit a school. And it's told from the point of view of the teachers and the students in the school, and it's absolutely harrowing. And that's the problem with total war. Once you move into the 19th century, into the 20th century, when everyone is a participant, suddenly everybody is at risk. And what happens? I mean, I suppose one way of looking at it would say it used to be what happened on the battlefield stays on the battlefield, but suddenly everywhere is the battlefield.
Yes, total war, and in particular, bombing of cities.
Yes, the bombing of civilian targets, which technically is a war crime, I think. That's one of the arguments that has been made since. I think under one of the Geneva Conventions, you're not supposed to bomb civilians.
Oh, well, let's move on swiftly from that and the record of the RAF in the war then. So from 42 onwards, I mean, nothing goes right. And the sea battles, they lose pretty much every sea battle from there on in. And on the land battles, as the Americans start to take the islands, the Japanese, well, they're outgunned, they're outsupplied, but even then their tactical sense feels like they're fighting the wrong war. Their tactics just don't work.
Yeah, and many of them are literally in the wrong place as well. So to start with Midway, it's technically part of the Hawaiian island chain, but it's like hundreds of miles away from the rest of it, and it's just this little atoll in the middle of nowhere. By the time of Midway, the Americans had cracked the code the Japanese used to communicate. And it's been suggested that that's why they knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen. I think that the trouble is the command to attack Pearl Harbor was climb Mount Niitaka, which even if you could crack that as a code, you wouldn't know what it meant. However, when it came to Midway, the Japanese had a plan to lure the American carriers to Midway on the grounds that Midway was out of fighter range of Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor could not support a surprise attack on carriers in Midway. And this was a great idea. Unfortunately, the Americans had cracked the code. So they sent a message about some broken boiler parts or something. on Midway. And then the next day they heard the Japanese saying, oh yeah, we need some boiler repair parts for the next mission. So they knew it was going to be Midway. And so the Japanese showed up just with what they thought would be a surprise attack, but actually they were surprised back. And it was a terrible disaster for them, because not only did they lose a lot of men and machinery, they lost their best pilots. They lost, was it 4 aircraft carriers? With the ground crew. I mean, that's the thing. You think in terms of planes, but it's not just the planes that they've lost. It's the pilots who take much longer to replace, and the ground crews. And so after Midway, the Navy has been eviscerated. It's been flensed of its best people. And you get planes that have been badly made in factories by people who don't know what they're doing, who are too tired to really get a good handle on it, being flown by people who haven't really learned how to fly properly, and serviced by ground crews who've forgotten which widget goes where. And this only adds to the kind of rolling damage that's done. And as you say, we have these various sea battles, which are reported in the Japanese press as victories that get successively closer to Japan each time they happen. And some people are saying that sounds a bit weird. And then you have the army being told, we need to defend these islands. We realize that the Americans are island hopping and they're seizing these bases. And Midway, strategically, to give you another counterfactual, wasn't that big a deal. It didn't really achieve anything. If the Japanese had won at Midway, the Americans would have been a few weeks later in their eventual return. But by that point, American factories are turning out so many ships and so many planes, a loss of Midway would not have drastically affected the war effort. It just would have made it longer. After Midway, you start to get on islands that are closer and closer to Japan. If you take Saipan, if you take Tinian, then you are in bombing range of Japanese targets. And of course, very famously, if you take Iwo Jima, then you're in bombing range of Tokyo. And technically, Iwo Jima is part of Tokyo. I don't know if you know this. Even though it's like 1,500 miles away, by some kind of weird zoning rule, it's actually the outskirts of Tokyo. And so the Navy, the Japanese Navy, was very well aware that if they lost Saipan, Tinian, then the Allied forces would have ground-based opportunities to send bombers after them. They wouldn't be clinging on to putting a Hoki bomber onto an aircraft carrier on a one-way mission. They would be within range, and that would cause trouble. So the army's told you have to defend these places, and the army is used to fighting battles, or has been trained to fight battles. It hasn't been trained to fight defense. And there's one case of a Japanese officer who said, the way to win this battle is for us to hold off the Americans for as long as possible, but a bunch of us can go and hide in the caves, and then when the Americans are on there, we can come out and fight them. But that meant a bunch of soldiers had to retreat, and no one would do it. They're like, no, we're here to fight. But, it goes against the manual for us to run away. And it's like, no, I want you to run away. I don't want you to hide in the forest for a bit. And so, it caused all kinds of trouble there, kind of convincing them that's what they were supposed to do. And eventually you have the army and the Navy saying, we need to establish an absolute defensive line. This is how Tojo spins it in the end. He knows that he's losing. He knows that these islands are falling one by one. The issue is, if we just hold these islands each island for as long as we can, we shatter like a jewel. And the first use of the term shattered jewel in military dispatches is actually at Attu, when the Americans take back Attu in Alaska. After that, you see the term shattered jewel turning up more and more, and Tojo starts using it in his speeches. He's like, what we want is a shattered jewel victory on each island, because we'll lose the island anyway. But when we lose that island, the Americans will have lost so many men and so many machines and so much time, they'll be demoralized. And the more we can demoralize them, the more we can convince them that every single place they take is going to be like this, better the chances that we can hold our absolute defensive line. And at some point they'll stop fighting and they'll say, okay, fine, let's just stick with things the way they are and sign a conditional. What Tojo was after was a conditional surrender, which he thought he could win by fighting this absolute defensive line. And of course, what that meant is they were just throwing thousands and thousands of men to their deaths. And they were celebrating and lionizing this idea of being a shattered jewel, to the point that it became an order. Okay, lads, it's time for the shattered jewel. Let's throw a grenade into the infirmary because we don't want anyone left alive. And that's when you get these suicide charges, these so-called banzai charges, for example. in this island combat, which, for the Allied forces is a terrible shock because they're not ready for that.
Yes, I mean, I think the refusal of the Japanese to give up, I think it just revolts the Americans because they're risking their lives to beat an enemy that is already beaten.
Yes.
I was reading an extraordinary statistic that amongst these island garrisons, typically between about 1% and 3% survive to surrender. I think I read that on the Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, I think it was 17 out of 3,600 are captured alive. And that's not untypical. And so I think to some extent the savagery with which the war is fought by the Americans, and it was pretty savage, is partly due to that.
Yes, and I think it's also worth mentioning that you say they were revolted by the Japanese resolve to just hang on to this territory at no cost. I think in a certain military sense, they were probably quite impressed by that. I think what revolted them was fake surrenders. That became one of the huge issues with the island combat, is that there were some occasions when a Japanese soldier would come out waving a white flag and actually be a human bomb, for example. And that started to tax their patience quite considerably. Also, I think this is probably a good time to talk about the trophy issue, which is something that's widely underreported in the history books, which was that after Guadalcanal, there was an effort among the Americans to suppress reporting of trophy taking by American soldiers. It's worth bearing in mind that 1 in 4 of the men who were in the American army were hunters, were either farm boys or people who fished and hunted for fun, and were well used to going out into the forest and shooting at people. And some of the propaganda, the American propaganda, was basically selling the chance to join up and fight as a chance to shoot Japanese, to hunt monkeys, as they once said.
God, horrible.
And this attitude, it turned out, and people are mentioning in dispatches after Guadalcanal, there are guys sending Japanese teeth back to their girlfriends, or cutting an ear off and keeping one as a trophy. And one man even presented Roosevelt with a paper knife that he'd made out of someone's rib cage, and Roosevelt's like, "Get this out of the Oval Office, for God's sake! What are you doing? We need to maintain the moral high ground here." And these trophies, are still an issue stretching right into the 21st century. There are some absolutely fantastic stories that totally sure should be an episode of an American crime show one day. There's a guy in 2001. They found a skull in a lake in Lake Columbia, somewhere in America. So the police get called. There's a human skull. It turns out that there was a war veteran who'd become a biology teacher and who had kept it on his desk, throughout his career, and that when he died, his grandson had inherited it, painted it gold and put it in a bandana, and had it in his bedroom for a while until, when he realized it was a bit creepy, he threw it in the lake to get rid of it. And this is the human remains of a Japanese soldier. And there are loads of cases like this. In my book, Japan at War in the Pacific, I actually talk about a production of Hamlet I was in, where we had a real Japanese skull playing Yorick.
Oh, my God.
I was in Portobello Road with my dad, and we were looking for skulls, and then there was one, in a glass case. And the woman selling it said, "Oh, very interesting story about this. It was a Japanese soldier." And my dad said, "I don't care what it is. We just need a skull. Thank you." And it took a while to kind of register that, you're dealing with, how did that skull get to London?
Right.
This sort of thing was something that they tried to keep quiet, and tried to encourage the Americans not to do. The skull I found in London, I suspect, came from a British soldier, so let's not just pretend it was just the Americans doing this.
There was, it's quite interesting, you mentioned the trophy taking. One of the moving parts of the Yasukuni Museum is that they have these, what is called the Hi no Maru flags. And I guess these were also taken as trophies, because I think many times the Japanese soldiers would have a flag prepared for them by their relatives, so to sort of take with them into combat, and it's kind of signed by all the neighbours and by the family. And so these were taken off the soldiers. And I think there's quite moving returns of these flags which take place even to this day. I think there's may even be a society which makes it his business to track down these flags and to bring them back to Japan.
Yeah, they've got the Hinamaro flags. They've got the 1,000-stitch belts, which are these, belts which everyone in the neighborhood is asked to add a stitch to, which at the beginning of the war was something that was discouraged by the authorities. And by the end, they were trying to get everyone involved. And so that became more of a thing. I have to say, actually, I went to Nagasaki, to the bomb park there. And there's actually a very moving exhibit there, which is basically, you know how they have those city maps in Japanese districts next to the police station where they tell you where everyone lives? There's one of those for Nagasaki with all the family names of all the people who were living in the bomb radius.
Huh.
And it's beautifully done. It's very, very subtle. It's just like, if this had not been bombed, these are the people who, Mrs. Matsumoto would live here, and, and the Terajima family are here. And it's just people's names. It's very simple.
So now the war is, everybody can see the war is going badly. So what's morale like on the home front? How are they coping?
Desperately, with a sense of desperation. Everything is becoming more drab and austere. I mean, in much the same way that wartime London, had to deal with rationing and so on. But in Japan, we're dealing with not only bombers appearing in the sky, not only with constant reports of people dying, but squeezes on food and resources. Teenagers are being co-opted into factories. The cinemas are being closed. The kids are being evacuated. These are all signs that things are not going well. There's this desperate scrabble for materials, destroying public artworks because they need the metal for stuff.
Do they not melt down poor old Hachiko?
They melted down Hachiko. So Hachiko, the loyal little dog who had become this kind of symbol of the Greyfriars Bobby of Japan, as it were. Yes, they carted away his statue, and they made a big deal of it as well. They said, Hachiko is doing his bit for the war effort. So we have this very moving ceremony where we all salute him as we kind of rip his statue off his pedestal and chuck it into a vat because we're trying to make more guns. So yeah, it's looking very badly. There's terrible restrictions on food. The Americans then commence Operation Starvation, which is the bombing of sea lanes and the mining of sea lanes, which is doing incredible damage to Japan and hitting the population where it hurts. So one of the other counterfactuals, of course, is about what would happen if there were ever an Allied landing on Japan. And there's substantial evidence that there wouldn't be any food left by, the late 1945. The fishing fleet had been sunk, couldn't go out and get any more fish. The fields were falling apart because there were so many people being, conscripted. Manchuria had a very good food output, had good agriculture still going on because Manchuria was basically safe until the Russians showed up. So that was great. But if you couldn't move Manchurian food across the Strait of Tsushima because it was being bombed or it was being mined, then that, restricted everything as well. So yeah, things are looking very bad. And the desperation shows up in popular culture. You do hear rumblings from people saying this ought to stop. Very controversially, Abe Shinzo, the late Japanese prime minister from, who was prime minister only a few years ago, who was a grandson of a wartime minister, he said, we should have recognized by 1943 that it was over. We should have recognized that. If we'd have made a decision then, we could have possibly salvaged something. But we kept fighting because we didn't want to admit, we doubled down so many times. We kept fighting and we were being dragged down with everybody else. And after he said that, someone sued the government saying, well, if you knew that, why did my, grandparents get killed in the war?
Right.
Yeah, it was looking desperate and the army and the navy couldn't admit that Yamamoto was right because many of them didn't know what Yamamoto had said in the entirety of his predictions.
I know you're keen to sort of look at popular music as a way to try and understand people's feelings, and it's quite interesting to me. In your book, you say that Western popular music is sort of abolished. I think it's made illegal to even listen to foreign songs. And some songs they don't even realize are foreign because it's become such a part of America, or such a part of Japanese culture.
That's right. Foreign songs were illegal. I mean, happy songs were illegal after a while. Basically, the radio is turning into nothing but war songs. These terrible dirges, like if we go to sea, the waters will cover our corpses. That's like the big toe tapper. So they're playing lots of military songs, lots of excitable kind of gung-ho songs, and it becomes illegal to play foreign music. And so the works of Stephen Foster, terribly pernicious propaganda songs like Alexander's Ragtime Band, these are all banned. And as you say, the real shock, even for General Tojo, because Auld Lang Syne is such an old song in Japan. I think it was translated into the Japanese in the 1880s. They call it The Firefly's Light. And it's such a well-known song. It's the last thing they play at a dance hall to signal that it's the end of the night. But it's also played at kind of Navy functions. And someone says to Tojo, we can't play that anymore. It's a foreign song. He's like, what do you mean it's a foreign song? He's like, yeah, it's Auld Lang Syne. It's not one of ours, mate. So, yeah. And also, of course, since I think 37, foreign films have been banned in Japan. You know, the Japanese aren't getting any foreign popular culture at all. And they're having to deal with whatever the local industry is churning out. And what it's churning out is these increasingly low budget wartime elegies. And at one point, I think this is 43, Masaoka Kenzo made a film called The Spider and the Tulip, which was this cartoon, sort of 20-minute cartoon, which was kind of evocative of Al Jolson and was about insects, you know, having a dance. And he was pilloried for it because it didn't have a martial message. Every film has to have a martial purpose. Even films are part of the war effort. And your thing about spiders is no good to us.
So I guess we should move on to the end of the war, and it's famously brought to an end by the dropping of the bombs at Hiroshima and then at Nagasaki. Why do the Americans drop the bomb? Because I think there's a common view which you hear expressed, you know, on the internet a lot. Oh, the Japanese were ready to surrender. You know, it would just been a matter of days before they would have surrendered, and this was this fantastically violent act. And I did see that somewhere that the emperor himself had been saying to his war cabinet, look, you know, it's time to sue for peace. So what do you think about that?
People had been wishing that Japan could surrender and it could all be over for literally years, I think, by this point, in, you know, various different parts of Japan, but just not voicing it. I think what makes it shocking is the emperor voices it. But the army and the navy are the ones who are going to carry the can for this if it ends. And they are still insisting that there's a chance they can hold the absolute defensive line. There's a chance that we can still shatter these jewels. Tojo puts out a radio message where he calls for 100 million shattered jewels, which is 70 million people, the population of Japan, 30 million people, population of the Japanese Empire. Tojo is saying, we just have to make it so difficult for them that they give up and sue for a conditional surrender, you know, draw the line somewhere. And the thing that really hammered that message home, I think, was Okinawa. In the Battle of Okinawa, the Americans faced such tough resistance from the locals. And those locals that were left alive then threw themselves off a cliff and killed themselves. But also, you know, they'd find a dead body and they'd pick it up and there'd be a hand grenade underneath and they'd lose somebody else. You know, the estimates for what it would cost to land Allied forces on Japan vary widely, because they asked MacArthur how many he thought it would take. And I think he gave them a figure like, I don't know, 1.4 million casualties if we attack Japan and the home islands. And then they go, oh, that's too much, let's not do it. And he goes, no, actually, just say 1.4, maybe less. But the experience of Okinawa, on top of the march across the Pacific from island to island, had convinced we keep saying the Americans, but the Allies are part of this too, that if they landed on Japan, it would make make Vietnam look like a tea party, because Vietnam hadn't happened yet. The Japanese were being told, you know, everyone get a sharpened bamboo stick, everyone take an American soldier with them. There's 70 million of us, and there's only 5 million of them, or whatever. You know, it was this brutal, and they were indeed starving, and that is an issue to bear in mind. And the Potsdam Declaration had called for an unconditional surrender. So the army and the navy knew there was no way they were getting out of this alive, basically. So they kept doubling down. And when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, I think there's several things to bear in mind. Certainly, I think the Americans are hoping, well, that's it. The Japanese are bound to surrender now. They're not counting on fake news saying it wasn't that big a deal. They're not counting on the army not listening. And they're not counting on the usual bluster of the army and navy saying maybe they've only got one. I mean, literally, maybe they've only got one bomb. These things are hard to make. We were trying to make one ourselves at one point. Maybe they've only got one. So, maybe they're bluffing. There's this message to America, oh, well, we will consider your demands. And everyone's like, what does consider mean? Is the check in the mail? What does that mean? And then Nagasaki comes next. There are two issues to consider, or I think one combined issue to consider with this. One of them is, let's just assume the main narrative, the common narrative. We will save American lives if we drop a bomb that is so catastrophic the Japanese have no choice but to surrender. Only an insane person wouldn't surrender after they got that. And we will save millions of lives by doing that. And probably millions of Japanese lives too. That's the common narrative about dropping the bomb. However, if you want to be more cynical about it, you can say America is already looking at the Soviet Union as the next enemy and nuclear conflict as the next possible means of combat. Dropping the bomb on Hiroshima is a way of speeding the end of the war to stop the Soviet Union entering the war and invading mainland Japan. We already know that the Soviet Union are coming in. They've entered the war at long last. They've taken Manchuria. They're taken Sakhalin. They're heading for Hokkaido. If they don't get the Japanese to surrender quickly, Japan will be cut in two like Korea. So possibly the escalation of these bombs is a means of really speeding the Japanese up if they want to be part of a democracy rather than a communist dictatorship. The second thing to bear in mind is the way that the Allies behaved about the bomb after it was dropped. There were researchers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki gathering data, walking around with Geiger counters, filming victims with keloid scars. And all this information was suppressed very famously. It wasn't until the 50s that Japan passed the Atomic Bomb Victims Medical Care Law that acknowledged there was such a thing as like subsidiary damage from radiation. So from 1945 to I think maybe 1958, no one in Japan was ready to admit or allowed to admit that if you were hit by an atomic bomb, it didn't just kill people, it also gave you cancer 5 years down the line, or it mutated your children, or it made you infertile, or the idea that there were long-term impacts from an atomic weapon that was not recognized is something that was suppressed until 58. And you could argue, if you wanted to be cynical about this, that this was all an experiment, that we've got this power, we've got this technology, it would really help us if we got to use it before the end of the war. So, in much the same way that all of the World War I technology was tested in the Russo-Japanese War, this is World War III technology we're going to test in World War II.
I don't think I am as cynical as that. I read, I think it's quite famous, Paul Fussell's book, or I guess it's an essay, which is called Thank God for the Atom Bomb. And he makes basically 2 points, which is that he's waiting, he's being organized, he's been sent to wherever to prepare to invade the main islands. And he's just profoundly grateful that the war ends before he has to land on the beaches. So that's one point he makes. And the other point he makes is that people are dying every day in the war. Ships are being sunk. People are starving to death in Asia. This is taking the lives of thousands and thousands of people every single day. So yes, maybe they would surrender 2 months later, but how many will have died in these 2 months? It's not like nothing is going to happen during these 2 months. And I found, it was a pretty vigorous essay, pretty powerful rhetoric.
Yes, it's brutal, but I don't see anything to disagree with that. I'm sure I would feel very different about the bomb if my grandfather had been killed in the Battle of Osaka.
Yes.
Should the Battle of Osaka ever taken place. And if you look at the plans for Operation Downfall, which is the landings in Japan, you can see that, millions more people would have died. But there is something particularly distasteful about nuclear weapons, which is very difficult to reconcile with. I think, were I American top brass in 1945, I would have totally gone with it. but I would also have been someone sitting there thinking of the Japanese as non-people.
Yes, it's so hard to get back in the minds. This is why I found the Yasukuni Museum so useful, as I felt it helped to sort of get me back into the minds of the people at the time. And it's so difficult to put yourselves into the minds of the people at the time and their attitudes, which just aren't our attitudes anymore. Things have changed. Look, let's sort of bring it towards the end now. There's sort of two subjects I want to talk about. The first is the surrender itself. So do you just want to tell us about about how the surrender, once the bombs are dropped, how do they finally bring themselves to surrender and what happens?
Well, here is the terrifying thing, which in some way goes towards our previous conversation about the using the bomb. Hirohito, says, I think we're going to surrender now. We and the army and the navy are like, no, there's still things. And he's like, no, I think I've heard enough of this. We've got to surrender. And he records the dual voice broadcast, which is an announcement to the people of Japan to say, it's all over. We must endure the unendurable. The progress of the war has proceeded not necessarily to our advantage, was one of the most amazingly Japanese things he said. And it was recorded. They took 2 goes to record it because he wasn't really used to speaking in public and he kept stammering and so on. But eventually they got it down and they got it etched onto a gramophone disc, and it was ready to be recorded. That night, a bunch of soldiers broke into the palace attempting to steal it, to stop it from being broadcast. And so, even as Hiroshima and Nagasaki are flattened by these bombs, even as the emperor himself has said, and let's not forget, we're all supposed to be loyal to the emperor said, okay, that's enough. I'm making a decision and I'm telling you to your face, we are surrendering. Still, there's a gunfight at the palace to try and seize control of this record, which is hidden in a safe room with the chamberlains and no one knows where it is. And the guy who leads the attack ends up running through the streets. He gets on a motorbike. He's throwing leaflets through the streets, as he goes. He runs into a radio station, points a gun at the announcer and says, I want to make a statement. And they kind of wrestle him to the ground and he shoots himself. And this is on the night before the surrender. There were still soldiers in Japan who were planning on running into the mountains and fighting. There were still, even after the surrender, there were quite controversial. There were Japanese, I think there were Navy planes that attacked American planes, even though the place had surrendered. And so on the day of the broadcast, they put the record on and the people of Japan hear Hirohito's voice for the first time. And some of them, the Japanese he speaks is so arcane and so archaic. Some of them don't even know what he said, but a lot of them realize that it really is all over. And then you get a number of suicides of people who kind of give up, but also you get a number of people who are afraid to admit just how relieved they are. They're terrified of what's going to happen when the Allies showed up. They're terrified of how they're going to be treated. And they are really often not quite ready for the behavior of the Allies when they do take over. Japan, of course, is occupied for 6-7 years afterwards.
And what is the behavior then of the Allied troops when they land?
Well, the big issue is that they round up the leaders and they start putting them on trial. One of the things that Tojo wanted to do was to run his own war trials, which is one of the reasons it was an unconditional surrender, because no one was going to let him do that. A message that the Americans give them is, we are turning your country into a democracy. We are rebuilding your country. You have been lied to for 30 or 40 years by these people. We ban all talk of the samurai. We ban all references to swords. Very famously, there's one of the occupation personnel saved kabuki by saying it's okay, it's not military, and we'll keep on doing it then, even though many kabuki performances were in fact reenactments of recent battles. They rewrite the Japanese constitution. Me saying that is quite controversial because the Japanese like to say they rewrote it themselves. They had a lot of very heavy pressure as to how it was going to look. You have, for example, a clause that gives women the right to vote. You have a clause that renounces war, which is they abolish the army, they abolish the navy. Japan instead today has self-defense forces, which look very army-like and navy-like, but are in fact supposedly not endowed with any offensive capability. And they put the criminals on trial. And very famously, they say, okay, if you watched a war crime happen and did nothing, you're C class. If you committed the war crime, you're B class. If you incited someone to commit it, you're A class. And they created this new kind of category, the incitement towards warfare, this idea that there was a certain bracket of the Japanese population who had lied and cajoled and threatened and forced the Japanese into fighting in the war, into believing all this fake news. And those were the people who were Class A war criminals. You know, we're talking about the Yasukuni Shrine. There's, I'm sure you've seen it. I don't know how obvious it is, but there's a memorial there to one of the judges at the war crimes trial, a man from what is now Bangladesh called Radha Binod Pal. And in the war crimes trial, you know, after they executed 900 people and put a load more in prison, ostensibly for life, he issued a dissenting judgment, which ran to about 1,200 pages. And he said, I'm not denying the Japanese were atrocious during the war. I'm not denying these savage war crimes. What concerns me is the notion of victor's justice. What concerns me is that you are putting some of these people on trial for a crime that did not exist before you invented it after it had happened. Let's talk about bombing. I mean, he mentions bombing civilian sites. He goes, so if we're talking about bombing civilian sites and we're calling that a war crime, why are we not also prosecuting our own people? This is victor's justice. You are inventing this new concept and then you're imposing it on these people. He said, as far as I can see, much as it pains me to say this, if a Japanese soldier pulls out a gun and shoots an American soldier on a battlefield, he is doing his job. We understand that war is a bad thing, but once you're committed to it, you're going to be killing people. And that's a very brief summary of the 1,200-page dissentient judgment. You know, for years, this was, I don't want to say suppressed, it was more like ignored. It came to light really with the age of the internet because someone could scan the whole thing into a PDF and you can actually find it online very quickly now. But up until the 1990s, no one really knew about this. And the Japanese loved the fact that someone could mount this argument in their defense. Actually, Radha Binod Pal was not defending the Japanese at all. He was ready to sentence a whole bunch of them to death. He did not approve in any way of the atrocities that the Japanese committed. But because of the way his reasoning sounds, in summary, it was something that was widely respected by the Japanese. And so they built this little memorial to him, which quotes very selectively from the dissentient judgment in the carving in front of it. Quite controversially, he finished with a quote from Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederates in the American Civil War, along the lines of, you know, history will judge. But Radha Binod Pal was part of a new development. He was part of the beginning of the Cold War. He was part of the dismantling of colonial powers. You know, this is a man who'd come from British India, as it were, who very much understood that the whole arguments that we've been having for 3 podcasts now about this alien game were coming to an end, not just for the Japanese, but for the Indians and for the Filipinos and everybody else.
Yes, his whole judgment must be informed by the fact that India, you know, it's a British colony and it's had enough of being a British colony and had enough for some years.
Yes. And so in many ways, he kind of brings up the alien game, you know, one last time and says, we can stop playing it now. And by the way, the Indians are... He didn't turn it into a message for Indian independence. He was a much better judge than that. But I do, you know, if anyone is interested in it's called the Dissentient Judgment of Radha Binod Pal. And if you Google it, you'll find it in seconds on the internet. And it's a massive PDF, typewritten pages. I mean, it was, you know, must be almost difficult to lift. But it's fascinating to see someone making such kind of postmodern arguments in 1945, 46.
Now, when I go to Japan, you know, I don't see anything about the war there, but I do still see, you know, I've seen the museum at Yasukuni, and you have these buses that occasionally you see driving around the streets of Tokyo, absolutely deafening loudspeakers blasting out. And I'm not really quite sure what they're saying, but when I ask my friends about them, they sort of say, oh, no, we haven't really seen them or heard these. And I'm thinking, you must have done. They are ear-splitting, and I can only assume that these are these mad Japanese nationalists So I guess it's all gone now, and yet there's still these little embers, remaining, these little memories.
Sure there are. And let's face it, every country's got its wackos. Japan is no exception. The idea of assassination as a tool of political argument has not gone away, as Abe Shinzo discovered to his cost only recently. And you say that you don't see the war in Japan unless you're in a museum. I would disagree with that quite strongly. I see the war in Japan everywhere I go. It's true that many of the wartime statues have been removed from their plinths and replaced by other things. There's a fascinating book about lost statues of Japan that tells you what used to be on that particular plinth at a particular time. And, you can be in the weirdest of places and walk past a war memorial. And unless you can read what's on the war memorial, you don't necessarily see it's there.
Mm.
I was in Sapporo, and I was just about to get a bus. And as I got on the bus, I saw that there was a memorial to the Siberian expedition. I was like, oh God, I need a photograph of that. But the bus was already leaving and, I kind of missed my chance. The Patriot Party, as we call them, are a big issue. And you do see them making demands for the return of Taiwan, for example. There was a big map on a poster I saw when I was a student in Japan that, had coloured in Sakhalin the same colour as Hokkaido and demanded it back. And of course, controversially, there are 4 islands on the tip of Hokkaido that Russia is still occupying, which the Japanese say, oh, no, those are the Kuril Islands. They belong to us from before the war started, so technically they should be ours. And the Russians go, well, they're not, because we've got a submarine base there, so you can't have them. And so, so technically there's still this argument about that, and every time Putin's in a good mood, he suggests that maybe we'll give 2 of them back. And the Japanese go, no, we want all of them back. So there's that kind of argument that no one talks about anymore. And yes, there are indeed far right-wing agitators who will stand in the street with a microphone, blaring out these martial songs about shattered jewels and calling for, various agendas. I was a student in Kyoto and I was walking down the street minding my own business, and I came across a little truck blaring the Myriad Enemies, which is the Navy anthem about shattered jewels, and a man with a microphone saying, we want the Kuril Islands back, we want Taiwan back, and we want all of the immigrants out of Japan. And much to his embarrassment, I was the only person that stopped to listen.
This frightful gaijin. One thought that I had when I was preparing for this podcast is, how long does it take really for history to sort of fade away so that you're left with the history and the bitterness is gone? Because, when I look back at, these catastrophes of history like Genghis Khan or the fall of Constantinople, they're just interesting to me. There's no bitterness there at all. And I just wonder, at what stage will the history of the wars with Japan, when will they just fade away like that?
I think it depends who you ask. There's a very long memory in Asia about what the Japanese did, particularly in mainland China, but also in Thailand and Vietnam and so on, which is often stirred up by demagogues. The Chinese attitude towards the Japanese is really just the Communist Party trying to create a new bogeyman, rather than, I think, a deep-seated anger about it. Nevertheless, if you ask someone who has a war veteran in their family, in Britain, in Canada, in America,
in Korea,
yeah. Well, Korea is a special case because the Koreans didn't just have the war to deal with; they had 35 years of occupation to deal with as well, which they are not only bitter about, but aggressively bitter about. Japan has a vast soft power outreach, which has done it a lot of good with the very young. And to answer your question about these people in history, this is a question that I have to face very often. On my book, Rebel Island, the sensitivity reader objected to an endorsement that we had from an academic who said that the book was entertaining. And she said, you can't call a book about the oppression of indigenous peoples entertaining. I said, well, as a popular historian, it's my job to entertain. We're not going to say on the cover of the book, this is thoroughly depressing. Nevertheless, that endorsement wasn't used. And, I can see where she was going with it as well. And you're quite right that sometimes when we use history as an entertainment, we forget that we're talking about the lives and deaths of real people. I actually do get quite empathetic and quite tearful about events that happened 2,000 years ago. I mean, once I was in the the Royal Academy of Art with my mother, and there was a exhibition of Japanese prints, and I was showing around and talking her through the stories attached to them. And I got to the Battle of Danoura and I started crying because I always get very emotional about it. And unfortunately, we'd attracted a crocodile of people who thought I was a guide, and they just didn't understand why I was kind of weeping in front of this picture. I think that there is a historian who's provided an answer to this, or certainly a way of thinking about it that I think is very valuable. And that's a man called Semyon Frank. And he suggested that everybody periodizes history in their mind into 3 different categories. There's everything that happened from Adam and Eve to my grandfather. And then there's what happened from my grandfather to me. And then there's what happened in my own life. And I think you can see, even in your own reaction to Genghis Khan versus World War II, that second category is still something that affects us and affects people that we know. We can still think ourselves into those people's lives in a way that possibly we can't for someone 200, 300, 400 years ago.
I think that's an excellent way of looking at it. What's happened to my parents and to my grandparents, I still think about emotionally. But before that, it's still possible to be emotional, but it's a different thing.
And I also think, to throw one more thing in, something that my grandfather once said about the Berlin Wall. He said, "It'll be up until we're dead." And what he meant by that was that whatever the fixes are at the end of World War II, they're things that have to be kept kind of live until the people who care about them have gone. And I think that's something you can also see happening in Taiwan. But so that could also be an issue as well, is that, some of these echoes of World War II are things that are dying with the dying of that generation. And then you see efforts at outreach, particularly in Germany, for example, about educating people about the past. And the Yasukuni Shrine is an attempt to educate people about the past, but it doesn't necessarily tell the story that certain war veterans on the Allied side would like to hear.
So yes, there are always different ways to tell the same story, and I do think that's one of the great strengths of your writing. Actually, is that you often give these multiple perspectives. Anyway, that's it. I think we reached the end of our mammoth 3-parter, and it's such a massive subject. But unless we're going to go on for another 10 episodes, I think we can end it there and feel we did it justice. But just before we close, could you just remind everyone of the name of your book about the wars?
Oh, it's called Japan at War in the Pacific. A source of great annoyance to me, because that's not what I wanted to call it.
What did you want to call it?
I wanted to call it Shattered Jewel. Because I thought that was, it's a really powerful image, and it's really evocative for me. But but my publishers at Tuttle are very good at selling books, and they understand that quite often these days you are not necessarily appealing to readers anymore, but to the algorithm that pushes the reader your way. And so they wanted the book to be called Japan at War in the Pacific, The Rise and Fall of the Japanese Empire in Asia, 1868 to 1945, because although that's not poetic at all and is very declaratory and blunt, it's basically #war, #Japan, pick this one first, Mr. AI. And if that sells me more copies of my book, then I have to defer to them.
Oh, well, we'll call the podcast, this podcast, we'll call that one Shattered Jewel.
Excellent. That's what I've always wanted.
Okay, well, that's it for today, and that's it for our series on Japan's wars. So once again, Jonathan Clements, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.